Welcome forward to Jesus' Course in Miracles. This is Chapter 4, The Root of All Evil. I'd like to actually start at the bottom of page 30 and be reading page 31 today. Only those who have a real and lasting sense of abundance can be truly charitable. This is quite obvious when you consider the concepts involved. To the ego, to give anything implies that you will do without it. When you associate giving with sacrifice, then you give only because you believe that you are somehow getting something better, so that you can do without the thing you give. Giving to get is an inescapable law of the ego, which always evaluates itself in relation to other egos, and is therefore continually preoccupied with the scarcity principle which gave rise to it. This is the meaning of Freud's reality principle. Since Freud thought of the ego as a very weak and deprived, capable of functioning only as a thing in need, the reality principle of the ego is not real at all. The ego is forced to perceive the reality of other egos because it cannot establish the reality of itself. In fact, its whole perception of other egos as real is only an attempt to convince itself that it is real. Self-esteem, in ego terms, means nothing more than that the ego has deluded itself into accepting its reality and is therefore temporarily less predatory. This self-esteem is always vulnerable to stress, a term which actually refers to a condition in which the delusion of the ego's reality is threatened. This produces either ego deflammation or ego inflammation, resulting in either withdrawal or attack. The ego literally lives by comparison. This means that equality is beyond its grasp and charity becomes impossible. The ego never gives out of abundance because it was made as a substitute for it. This is why the concept of getting arose in the ego's thought system. All appetites are getting mechanisms, representing the ego's need to conform itself. This is as true of bodily appetites as it is of the so-called higher ego needs. Bodily appetites are not physical in origin. The ego regards the body as its home and does try to satisfy itself through the body, but the idea that this is possible is a design of the ego, which is completely confused about what is really possible. This accounts for its erratic nature. The ego believes it is completely on its own, which is merely another way of describing how it originated. This is such a fearful state that it can only turn to other egos and try to unite them within a feeble attempt at identification, or attack them in an equally feeble show of strength. It is not free, however, to consider the validity of the premise itself because this premise is its foundation. The ego is the belief of the mind that is completely on its own. Its ceaseless attempts to gain the soul's acknowledgement and thus to establish its own existence are utterly useless. The soul in its knowledge is unaware of the ego. It does not attack it. It merely cannot conceive it at all. For the ego is equally unaware of the soul. It does perceive itself as rejected by something which is greater than itself. This is why self-esteem in ego terms must be a delusion. The creations of God do not create myths, although the created efforts of man can turn to mythology. It can do so, however, only under one condition, that man then makes. What man then makes is no longer creative. Myths are entirely perceptions and are so ambiguous in form and so characteristically good and evil in nature that the most benevolent of them is not without fearful components, if only by innuendo. Myths and magic are closely associated in that myths are usually relegated to the ego origin, and magic is the power which the ego ascribes itself. Every mythological system includes some account of the creation and associates this with its particular perception of magic. The battle for survival is nothing more than the ego's struggle to preserve itself and its interpretation of its own beginning. This beginning is always associated with physical birth because no one maintains that the ego exists before that point in time. The religiously ego-oriented believe that the soul existed before and will continue to exist afterwards, after a temporary lapse in ego life. Such actual beliefs that the soul will be punished for this lapse, even though in reality it could not possibly know anything about it. The term salvation does not apply to the soul, which is not in danger and does not need to be salvaged. Salvation is nothing more than right-mindedness, which is not the one-mindedness of the soul, but which must be accomplished before the one-mindedness can be restored. Right-mindedness dictates the next step automatically because right perception is uniformly without attack, so that wrong-mindedness is obliterated. The ego cannot survive without judgment and is laid aside accordingly. The mind then has but one direction in which it can move. The direction which the mind will take is always automatic, because it cannot but be dictated by the thought system to which the mind adheres. Every thought system has internal consistency, and this provides the basis for continuity of behavior. However, this is a matter of reliability and not validity. Reliable behavior is a meaningful perception as far as ego thinking goes. However, valid behavior is an expression which is inherently contradictory, because valid is an end and behavior is a means. This cannot be combined logically because when an end has been attained, the means for its attainment are no longer meaningful. A hypothesis is either false or true, to be accepted or rejected accordingly. If it is shown to be true, it becomes a fact, after which no one attempts to evaluate it unless its status as fact is questioned. Every idea to which the ego has accorded the status of fact is questionable, because facts are in the realm of knowledge. Confusing realms of discourse is a thinking error which philosophers have recognized for centuries. Psychologists are generally quite deficient in this respect, as they are many theologians. Data for one realm of discourse do not mean anything in another because they can be understood only within the thought system of which they are a part. Thus concludes page 31.